Manifest Destiny, the cultural carnage of the Indian Removal Act.
What if you were held at gunpoint and forced off your land that you lived on for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, just so white Americans could take your land for themselves? The Indian Removal Act was initiated by Andrew Jackson and displaced thousands of Native Americans. Settlers infringed on their basic rights and took their land away from them. Today, it is our responsibility to respect their land and ensure the same injustice does not repeat itself. This is what our topic is about, and to know why it started, we should understand what led up to this event. Prior to the act, 98% of Native Americans had already died globally. Many tribes had gone extinct because of disease. The majority of these deaths were because of smallpox and the plague. Before the Indian Removal Act, settlers had already been creating unfair treaties for the Native Americans.
For example, in August 1794, the Treaty of Greenville was signed. This was signed after a short battle led by Anthony Wayne that ended in an American victory. As a result of the war, the Native Americans were forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville, in which they had to give up a lot of modern-day Ohio to the American forces. Settlers thought this was a sign from God to take more land from the Native Americans and that God was guiding them to these lands. One of these nations was the United States, who believed in manifest destiny, which was an idea that Americans had to settle and move more westward.
Native American tribes were often used to win wars. For example, the British during the American Revolutions promised the Native Americans that they would never expand outside of their current borders if they assisted the British. However, by the time the United States of America and British Canada had settled on permanent borders, the Native Americans served very little purpose to the Americans, and thus the Americans broke many treaties or used loopholes in their treaties. They often justified these treaties by giving Native Americans reservations. However, the reservations were often smaller and held worse lands than their former reservations.
One of these events was the Cherokee Gold Rush. This gold was found in the Appalachian Mountains, which was ruled and owned by the Cherokee Nation. They had already lived there for hundreds of years. They had complete authority over this land, however, many miners came anyway without the permission or consent of the Cherokee tribes. Despite this, the Cherokee Nation continued to reject these treaties. Another important event was in Florida, where the Seminole Nation was. The Seminoles have already been accepting black slaves from plantations, which had been costing the U.S. a lot of money. Because of this, the U.S. told them to relocate from their land to the designated Indian Territory. However, some of the Seminole continued to refuse. Because of this, the U.S. declared war on them. This resulted in escalating tensions between Native Americans and settlers. Andrew Jackson, who is the person who signed the Indian Removal Act, is often referred to the 5 tribes as civilized tribes. These 5 tribes were the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. Many Native American tribes' ideas for their future clashed with American ideas, which is why in May 1830, Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. The Native Americans had already been discriminated against by American settlers. Many Native Americans were not given enough food and were in poverty. The land they were able to keep was often dangerous or inadequate for a population of their size. Many Native Americans had been struggling for decades, and by the 1750s, most of their land had been forcefully taken or sold. The ones who attempted to stay were often met with horrible conditions. They were forced to move west of the Mississippi River, where 15,000 Native Americans would tragically lose their lives because of Andrew Jackson. This devastated many Native American tribes, some of which never recovered to this day. Most of them were moved to Oklahoma onto new reservations, with close votes being 28 Senate votes in favor and 19 votes against. They also had 101 votes in favor and 97 against in the House. When Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, it ended up removing thousands of Native Americans from their native homelands where they once lived for thousands of years. They moved them to the west of the Mississippi River, most often being Oklahoma or the Great Basin, which consists of most of northern U.S. During these times, many Native Americans had begun to clash, mostly against themselves, however, sometimes with the government. One of these clashes happened in the Cherokee Nation, when many Native Americans argued about moving or staying. Many of these Cherokee tribes did not want to move and they wanted to stay where they were because they had already been living there for thousands of years. Some others wanted to grab the best land while they could because they knew they'd have to leave anyway. By 1836, Native Americans were moved west of the Mississippi River onto Oklahoma or the Great Basin. These 2,000 Cherokee weren't the only ones, though. Many Cherokee in other areas of Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and the entire U.S. had totaled to approximately 100,000 Native Americans. This resulted in the death of 15,000 people. This is often referred to as the Trail of Tears. This was one of the worst acts the U.S. government has ever done to the Native Americans. They had to go through dangerous terrain without proper equipment. This long journey was called the Trail of Tears because of its devastating effects and the amount of hunger, disease, and exhaustion the Native Americans faced. The treaty took away the rights of these people, including their right to full ownership of land and their right to freely travel, fish, and hunt. Their full citizen rights were not fully restored until 1924. However, it wasn't just the five civilized tribes. Many other Native American tribes were sent too, specifically the Dakota and the Miami. After the Trail of Tears, the five civilized tribes were never the same, and so were many others. Many others were given reservation in Oklahoma and the Basin and were forced to live in these new land they were given. Many tribes lost a lot of their population and many of them went extinct. Some of these tribes have still never recovered to this day. A lot of them lost their homes and are now in poverty. The government often promised money towards these tribes, but the majority of them were never paid. Today, many of these reservations continue to live in poverty. Native American tribes are one of the worst affected by coronavirus and other viruses because of delayed healthcare and attention to these tribes. Many reservations and tribes have their rights denied, and many companies often abuse their land for profits without the permission of the tribes.
The responsibility we take on as living beings who live in these native peoples' land to this day is to respect and remember their culture, traditions, and the suffering that they went through so that we are where we are today. In the interview, Claudio Sant, a historian, said, quote, "The term Indian removal does not capture the violence that underlay the policy," end quote. To us, this means that today we can respect the native people by being cautious of what terms we use and how we use them.